The chair scraped loudly across the cafe floor as the man stood up to leave, the sound sharp enough to slice through the soft daytime hum of clinking cups and low conversations. Sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows, but it did nothing to warm the hollow ache left behind when he walked away, abandoning the table, the untouched coffee, and the woman who had dressed up for hope and was now left staring at an empty seat. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sat perfectly still, fingers wrapped around the porcelain cup, watching steam rise and disappear like the expectations she had allowed herself to feel again. Her name was Arwen Vale, and beneath the calm elegance of her posture lived a heart that had learned, painfully, how to survive disappointment. People in the cafe saw a beautiful woman in a soft, flowing dress, framed by daylight and quiet wealth. None of them knew she owned half the buildings they passed on their way to work. None of them knew she had built an empire after losing everything that once made her feel human. All they saw was a woman alone. Across the street, through the glass, Elias Crow paused with his hand on the cafe door. He hadn't planned to stop. He was still in his work clothes, worn jeans, and a faded jacket that smelled faintly of sawdust and effort. His phone buzzed with a reminder he couldn't afford to ignore: school pickup in 30 minutes. His life was measured in minutes and sacrifices, not chances. But something pulled him inside anyway. Maybe it was the quiet sadness he felt even before he understood why. Maybe it was the empty chair. Elias had learned to recognize loneliness. It lived in his small apartment where toys were neatly stacked because mess meant chaos he couldn't afford. It lived in his mornings, when he packed lunches with notes his daughter might not read until years later. It had lived beside him since the day his wife's heartbeat faded on a hospital monitor, leaving him holding a newborn and a grief too large to speak. He didn't go to cafes to sit. He went to grab and go. But today, he paused. The server glanced at him with polite confusion when he gestured toward the empty seat across from Arwen. She looked up then, startled, eyes glossy but composed. Elias gave a small, apologetic smile, the kind worn by people who ask for very little and expect even less. He pointed again, silently asking permission to sit. She nodded before thinking, because silence felt unbearable and the empty chair felt like an accusation. He sat down, awkward at first, resting his hands on his knees as if unsure what to do with them. The sunlight caught the lines in his face, not of age but of responsibility. Arwen noticed the way his eyes carried exhaustion and kindness in equal measure. He noticed the way she held herself like someone used to being looked at, yet somehow unseen. Their conversation began without words, built from shared pauses and tentative smiles. Elias explained, in fragments and gestures, that he was waiting for a call from his daughter's school. Arwen nodded, understanding more than he said. She offered him the abandoned coffee with a small shrug, and he hesitated before accepting, as if taking anything came with invisible cost. The cafe around them softened, the background blurring into a cinematic quiet where two strangers occupied the same fragile moment. After this first aching turn of fate, if you're watching Broken Smill and you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stories like this live because people still believe broken moments can lead to something beautiful. Arwen didn't tell him who she was. She never did on first meetings. Money had a way of changing the temperature of a room, turning warmth into calculation. She wanted, just once, to be seen without the shadow of her success. Elias didn't ask. He spoke instead about his daughter's laugh, how it reminded him that life could still surprise him. He talked about how he had learned to braid hair badly and cook meals that weren't terrible. His voice carried no self-pity, only quiet pride threaded with longing. She listened like someone who hadn't been allowed into a real story in a long time. Her world was boardrooms and private flights, contracts signed with hands that never shook. After inheriting debt and disaster from a father who had gambled everything, she had rebuilt with ruthless focus. In doing so, she had armored herself against intimacy. Dates felt like interviews. People wanted the empire, not the woman. The man who left earlier had recognized her surname and suddenly remembered an urgent meeting. The chair still held his absence like a bruise. Elias shifted uncomfortably when his phone buzzed again, a reminder that time was running out. He stood to leave, apologizing with his eyes more than his words. Arwen felt panic rise unexpectedly, a sharp fear of returning to the echo of that empty seat. She gestured toward the window, toward the street, offering to walk with him. He hesitated, then agreed, because something about her presence made the day feel less heavy. Outside, daylight spilled generously over the sidewalk. The city felt alive in that midday way, people rushing past without seeing the small miracle unfolding between two lives briefly aligned. They walked side by side, their steps finding an unconscious rhythm. Elias spoke about the woodworking shop he ran from his garage, about commissions he turned down because bedtime stories mattered more. Arwen spoke about art she collected not for value but because it made her feel something she couldn't name. When they reached the school, Elias stopped short, suddenly self-conscious. He hadn't planned for anyone to see this part of his life. But when his daughter burst through the doors, backpack bouncing, and launched herself into his arms, Arwen felt something crack open inside her. It wasn't envy. It was recognition. Love lived here, raw and unpolished, and it terrified her with how much she wanted to be near it. Days passed. Then weeks. They met again, always in daylight, always in places that felt honest. Parks. Sidewalk cafes. Hardware stores where Elias needed supplies and Arwen learned the language of nails and wood. He never asked what she did. She never offered. Each of them carried their own fear, Elias that wanting more would end in loss, Arwen that revealing herself would ruin what little truth they had found. The test came on a bright afternoon when Elias's shop flooded after a burst pipe. Water soaked through wood and dreams alike, threatening the fragile income that kept his world afloat. He stood ankle-deep in loss, shoulders slumped, trying not to let panic show because his daughter was watching. Arwen arrived unexpectedly, shoes ruined, sleeves rolled up, helping without asking. But when she made a call, when the repair crew arrived faster than logic allowed, Elias saw the gap between them open like a fault line. He broke then, quietly, ashamed of the resentment he felt toward a help he couldn't match. He pulled away in the days that followed, convinced he had mistaken kindness for belonging. Arwen felt the distance like a physical wound. For the first time in years, she was terrified not of losing control, but of losing someone who mattered. She told him the truth in daylight, standing in the middle of the repaired shop with sawdust still in the air. She told him about the billions, about the loneliness that came with power, about how sitting alone in a cafe had felt more honest than any gala she'd attended. She expected anger. She expected him to walk away. Instead, Elias sat down heavily on a workbench, the weight of it all pressing in. He thought of his wife, of promises broken by fate, of how unfair it felt that life kept testing him. He thought of his daughter's laugh. He thought of the empty chair that had brought them together. And slowly, painfully, he understood that love didn't arrive when you were ready. It arrived when you were brave enough to stay. Near the ending of this journey, if this story has begun to touch something inside you, please support it by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Broken Smill. These stories survive on hearts that still feel deeply. They didn't fix everything overnight. Elias refused money, insisted on earning his way forward. Arwen learned how to step back, how to love without control. They built something fragile and strong, shaped by patience and mutual respect. Daylight continued to follow them, a quiet witness to small victories and honest setbacks. Before we reach the final moment, take a second to comment and share what this story made you feel. On another sunlit afternoon, they returned to the same cafe. The same table. The same chair. Elias pulled it out and sat down, filling the space that once held abandonment with presence and intention. Arwen watched him, heart full and steady, knowing that wealth had never been the thing that saved her. It was the courage to sit in an empty place and believe someone